Good afternoon and welcome to welcome to Sign Language, where we are visualizing acoustics during COVID-19 with spatial signal processing. We are from the New Mexico School of the Arts, Team 13. My name is Rowan Janssens.
I'm Madeline Kingston.
And I'm Brandon Morrison.
And our mentors were Mohit Dubey and Stephen Guerin.
Okay. So at the beginning of this project, we were interested in the nature of sound waves and how they can be modeled and the applications of those models. COVID-19 has had a massive impact on everyone's life, and as musicians, many of us have been unable to perform together in person. We also saw the need for ways to contact trace the spread of COVID to ensure everyone's safety. We created a sandbox wave model, which we nicknamed the Wavebox, that we can, over the course of our project, we could implement two applications to remedy these problems. First was a way of tracking COVID infections using a sonic proximity system that uses sound to track the distance between 2 points. And second was a spatial audio rendering system that shows how it would sound like if musicians were performing together in real life.
So now that we've identified what we wanted to model, we need to figure out how we're going to model that. And as Brandon said, we came up with this idea for the Wavebox. So we first needed to come up with some equations that we could implement into NetLogo, which is the program that we decided that we would use for all of our modeling. In our research, we came across the shallow water wave equations, which are a series of partial differential equations that are used to model the height of water in some body. But really, we found that these equations can be applied to any wave in general, whether it's sound waves, light waves, or water waves. So in this expression, which is tailored to be used in NetLogo, we're calculating the vertical velocity of a certain patch by summing over all of the current heights of the neighboring patches and then subtracting the height of the current patch times the number of neighbors. So in the most simple scenario, we're going to be examining a one-dimensional rope. And then there's a ripple along that rope, and we can use this equation to model it. So in this case, K is going to be equal to 2, because there are 2 patches on either side of the patch that we're calculating for. So at the bottom of this slide, we've got a pictogram showing kind of 2 examples situations where we might be calculating the velocity. In the first example, the neighboring patches are equally distanced away from the center patch in red, which is the one we are currently calculating. And so in this scenario, the sum term will be 0, and the second term will also be 0. So this patch will have 0 vertical velocity, and in the next patch, it will not move at all. On the other hand, on this example kind of on the right, we see that the 2 neighboring patches are higher, and therefore this patch will gain a net upward velocity. So over time, this patch will move upward. So implemented onto a rope, this is what it looks like. As you can see, the rope kind of oscillates up and down, and as time progresses, that wave moves along the rope. But for our model, 1 dimensions is not going to be enough, so we want to scale that up to 2 dimensions. Luckily, we can use the exactly same equation. The only difference we need to do is now K, which was previously 2, we're now going to use K is equal to 4 to represent the 4 patches in the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. So when we scale this equation to 2 dimensions, we get this. So here we've got a plane, we've got the same sinusoidal wave that's being driven at some point, and then we're watching how it propagates out from there. So from this point on, we decided that we needed to tailor our model to represent exactly what we're modeling, which is sound waves. So it's at this point important to stop thinking it as velocity and height of the patches, but more of the pressure of the patches, because previously the equation was looking at water waves, but now we're moving to sound waves, and sound waves operate by changes in pressure through the air. So we're going to stop thinking about it as height and think about it as pressure. Additionally, we're going to add 2 variables into our equations. The first variable is going to be called the surface tension variable, denoted by alpha here. And the surface tension variable scales the entire equation that I just talked about. So now the change in pressure with respect to time is equal to all of that sum minus the current height, and then we're scaling that by alpha. Additionally, we added a sustain variable denoted with beta, and that scales how much the new pressure is going to be affected by the old pressure and the change in pressure. So every single tick in our model we calculate the change in pressure with respect to time, that partial P, partial T, and then we're going to add that to the old pressure, and then we're scaling that by beta to get the new pressure for the next tick. So once we have these two variables, we needed to figure out what values we should choose for them. And we decided we'd do this by optimizing the model to match some predefined quality. The predefined quality we chose was the inverse square law in free space. The inverse square law basically states that from a source object, the amplitude will decrease by 1 over the square of the distance. For example, at this square over here, 2r, we can expect the amplitude to be 1 over 2 squared, which is 1/4 of the amplitude at r, because it's twice as far away. So with this research in mind, we came up with a method for optimizing and tuning our model. And that is we calculate this score down here by taking the absolute value of 1/4 of the amplitude at some distance r minus the amplitude at some distance a2r, which is twice as far away. So if it perfectly matches the inverse square, this term will become 0. And then what we can do is we can do a parameter sweep where we do a ton of different surface tension and sustain combinations and see which combinations score lowest. So the results of these parameter sweeps are displayed here. To declutter the data, I have just plotted the surface tension tuning results here. And as you can see, there's a very clear minimum point at 98.5. So 98.5 seemed like the ideal surface tension variable that we could use that would kind of make the model behave most like the inverse square law. And for sustain, we realized that 0.991 was the optimal value. And you'll notice that this inflection point is a result of the absolute value term in our function. That's why it kind of goes down and then it dips back up. So now that we've got these two variables and their optimized results, we've implemented that into the model. And the center image here is what it looks like when those waves are propagating with those values selected. Meanwhile, the sustain and surface tension with the kind of extremes of the testing are displayed on the left and the right. And we found that with this combination, our percentage error was less than 1% compared to the inverse square law of what it should be. At this point, I'll also note that we implemented two different objects within our NetLogo model. The first object being a speaker, which is able to manipulate the amplitude of the field at some point. So it does just like what a speaker would do. It kind of sends out waves. And we've also got a microphone object, which receives waves. And then we can read off from the microphone what the amplitude is at certain points. So in this picture, you can see the black square up at the top. That is a speaker. The red dot at center is a microphone, and we will be using these two objects for the rest of our experiments.
Okay, so now I will talk about one of the applications of the Wavebox, which is the sonic proximity system. So we wanted to find a way to track COVID-19 spread during the pandemic. We looked at using GPS technology, but found that it wouldn't work well because of its poor accuracy with vertical height inside of a building, and because of how it doesn't account for walls when tracking the distance between two people, which in that case would cause false positives. Instead, we decided to use ultrasonic waves because they move slow enough for us to time them and measure the distance, and because they don't go through walls like GPS does. By timing how long it takes for sound to travel some distance with just millisecond precision, we can expect to get an accuracy of plus or minus 34 centimeters, which for this case we thought was optimal. So we modeled this in NetLogo, and this picture on this slide kind of shows how it works. So the first phone sends out an initial ping, and then the second phone picks it up and sends a return ping. And the first receives that ping, which is the ultrasonic sound, and uses the amount of time it took to calculate the distance. Sorry about the background noise. We are in a school, so. Okay. So in this video, you can see how that works in NetLogo. So we combine both the emitters and the detectors to make the phones in NetLogo as they act as both a speaker and a microphone. And that's kind of how they would work in real life. So you could see that the first phone sent out the ping and the second got it and then sent out a return ping. And then at the very bottom of the video, if you could see at the end, we got a measurement which showed how many units were calculated for the distance based off of the amount of ticks it took. Okay. So after we had a functional model, we tried to make a prototype for real life in JavaScript. We used a fast Fourier transform to detect the audio frequencies, and we used this equation that is shown in the slide to calculate the distance. And here are the results that we got from that experiment. Unfortunately, we only had an accuracy of plus or minus 5.7 meters, which isn't accurate enough to be very helpful, especially with this application with COVID-19. We found that we were limited by the web audio API, which wouldn't allow us to get the accuracy we wanted. Thankfully, our model in NetLogo worked well, which we found to be satisfactory. Our idea wasn't flawed, as a group from Carnegie Mellon was able to create a similarly operating system that was successful in the app Novid, which the logo you can see at the bottom. So because of all this, we then decided to move on to our next application of the Wavebox, which Manny will talk about in the next slides.
So the next application that we did was spatial audio rendering. So as musicians, we were really interested in modeling sound in a room, especially when we could not play together in real spaces. The methods currently used in music production for this purpose are algorithmic and convolution reverb. Convolution reverb is created by an impulse response file, which is recorded in a space. So if I were to make one of this room, I would have some sort of trigger sound like a clap or a gunshot, and then record the way that those sound waves decay, which then can be mathematically combined with any sound file to apply that effect. The other version is algorithmic reverb, which is a synthesized computer manipulation of the waveform of the sound that can be used to imitate a space or form an imagined effect. A really common example of this you might know about is called spring reverb. So these work as a shortcut for giving spatial effects, but they're not a direct spatial simulation. And tracks and recordings have to be panned to give an illusion of space in addition to this, which is not as effective as a modeled space. Additionally, we can't use these things in a space that doesn't exist, such as during COVID, when you want to perform in a space that maybe doesn't have a convolution reverb that's been recorded for it. That's not effective. And additionally, if you wanted to make video game sounds more spatial, that's not possible with these particular methods. So the way that we created this new kind of form of sound, or this, is that we created a sound input, which was 2 notes played on a violin at the same time. We recorded that as a wave file, which can be read with the NetLogo Python extension. And then we can drive those wave amplitudes through NetLogo through a Python array. And we can also manipulate the NetLogo space to resemble whatever space you want to affect the sound, such as by adding a wall or changing the materials that are in that space. We then let the sound propagate in the wave box after having been emitted from that microphone object, or from the speaker object, and then recorded the output of the wave box again using the microphone object in the Python extension. That recording can be saved as a new wave file, and then we can do a Fourier analysis of the output as well as listen to it. So we did this process with a number of different renders of the same 3.5-second clip of 2 notes on a violin with an 8,000 hertz sample rate, and analyzed the outputs. The initial render was with the surface tension and sustain variables optimized to match the inverse square law that we had found earlier, which means that the surface tension is at 98.5 and the sustain is at 0.991. So this is what it sounds like. So just going to check really quickly, were you all able to hear that in terms of sharing audio?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And the output was extremely distorted, so it sounds like it's underwater. And as you can tell from the spectrogram, almost all of the high frequency data is missing above 5,000 hertz. So all of the overtone series for those 2 notes are not available. So the next one that we did was a lower surface tension. So the second render, we changed the surface tension to create an optimal sound, and we found that as the surface tension decreases, the cutoff in the data for higher frequencies that occurred around 5,000 hertz or 500 hertz in the last render rises to include more of the overtone series, as you can see in the spectrogram. So these sound pretty similar, but the frequency data cutoff is practically non-existent. So there's no audible frequency degradation, and the presence of echo and reverberation accounts for the increased smoothness in the waveform, as well as increased noise in the spectrogram. Sorry. For the third render, we changed the sustain variable to optimize the sound quality again, and found that lower sustain added less reverb to the output, making it resemble more closely the original recording, whereas higher sustain made it sound more echoey. By coincidence, it's also common to have a sustain variable within a digital audio workstation to adjust both convolution and analytical reverb, and it was cool for us to find out that our sustain variable operates in a very similar manner. So as you can see, it sounds like with the last version of this, that the performance is happening in somewhere that's not necessarily someone's bedroom, but more of a concert hall. So finally, we created a render with a sound impermeable barrier with just one small space for sound to get through, which, as you can see in the video, is on the very far right. So, and this is what it sounded like. So you can tell that all of the higher frequency data has been cut off after a certain point, giving the effect of a muffled sound, which is what we expected, given that it's harder for higher frequencies to pass through solid surfaces. And only the sound is only coming through a small gap in the soundproof wall. Additionally, this sounds a lot like what you would expect it to sound like if someone was playing an instrument on the other side of a wall right next to you, which means that the model did a pretty successful job of creating this sound. So this is as far as we got when we wrote our paper, but since then we have built upon our model to include support for stereo output and multiple inputs. So the stereo output is created by having two microphones that are separated by a Jacklin disc, which is a pretty common recording device. In this case, we use just a wall barrier in NetLogo. And this creates a binaural recording, which is designed to capture audio like a human head. And there are multiple sonic inputs. There's also space for multiple sonic inputs, so you could have more than one performer in this space at the same time. So we actually enlisted two vocalists from our school to record parts of themselves singing a duet, where then we could put their recordings in different places and record the stereo output. If you aren't wearing headphones or, sorry.
And Arte, Romero, Carver, please come pick up your lunch in the office. Thank you.
Sorry about the announcements, but if you aren't wearing headphones or if your Zoom doesn't have stereo capabilities, you won't be able to hear the difference. But Rowan has just put the link to this Google Drive in the chat, and if you'd like to listen to it on your own, it might work a lot better. But you should be able to hear the stereo audio in this recording.
A whole new world. That's where we'll be. A thrilling chase for you and me.
So, in our future work, we hope to be able to get a deeper understanding of our model behavior, especially with the second application, given that we didn't quite understand exactly the science behind the sustain and surface tension variables. Additionally, we would like to be able to have more obstacles with unique material properties, such as a couch versus a table will have very different interactions with the sound around them. Additionally, we want to be able to have movable instruments and speakers while rendering, which means that we could have movable performers and listeners. An example of this would be someone walking down a hallway with musicians playing in rooms on either side of them. This render would be useful in a virtual reality or in a video game. Additionally, this obviously isn't a three-dimensional space like the world that we live in, so there is going to be some separation with what this sounds like with what sound might sound like in the actual space. So we would want to add a third dimension. And additionally, there's a way to import a modeled space from a drawing in NetLogo. So if you have a piece of paper and you draw out the lines and turtles, then you can import that image into NetLogo and it will recreate that space, which means that any imagined space possible could be formed in our model. Additionally, we want to eventually upload this model up into AgentScript, which has a faster processing power, as well as being accessible to more people to use and explore. So we want to give a special thank you to our spatial performers, Manouk and Lucia, the two vocalists. And these are our references if you are interested. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. Judges, any questions?
I think it was an excellent project and I'm still processing. I'll probably come back with questions in a minute.
I'm usually very slow to process, so but anyway, I'm curious why you didn't address probably what's the biggest problem in remotely collaborating in music is the differences in delay with different, as things propagate through the network, different performers have different amounts of delay. And getting all that settled out.
So this doesn't work as a live performance space because of the processing power and delay. Instead, this would be a way to take two recordings that you might just pin together in some sort of program like iMovie or something like that to create a performance. And instead, we put them together in this model so it sounds as if they were performing in the same space. However, you would have to record both of the parts ahead of time. Although that's what we have been doing throughout this whole pandemic as musicians, is to record our parts separately and then put them together. Our goal was just to make this sound a little bit more like we were actually performing in the same space and less like the recordings are pasted together in a program. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, you were dealing with a different problem than what I was thinking you were dealing with. That's where I got confused.
Yeah, this has been a big problem for us during this pandemic, especially with creating virtual concerts and stuff like that. So it was really cool for us to actually be able to solve this problem and create a way for musicians to sound like they're in the same room even when they can't be.
Anyone else have any questions, or are you still like processing? I don't know.
Maybe if you weren't able to listen to the stereo render on your own time, like it's really cool if you can hear the stereo effect because it's pretty clear.
Judges, does anyone have any questions?
I guess I'm probably going to ask in an area that you may not have developed an answer yet, but I'm curious about a couple of things. So one is you had to modify the parameters away from where the inverse square law was obeyed. So I'm curious what you think about that. And secondly, any thoughts you have about what the physical interpretation of what you call surface tension is?
That's a good idea. Okay, I think I can talk about that. So
Okay.
We are somewhat confused as to, as I was saying, we don't understand fully why the model didn't work with the variables that we chose. But we did do some significant research after we found this out, and we looked at the obeyance of the inverse square law with the kind of lower surface tension particularly, because it like sustain was less important, but surface tension really was the big one. What we thought was interesting is that the model breaks down when surface tension is below 50, like exactly. So so it seems like there's something with the limitations of the equation perhaps, and the way we are scaling our information by this value, because, you know, as soon as we drop just a little bit below 50, the model like breaks down, you get like math errors basically, and the whole screen kind of starts flashing and it goes pretty crazy. So I think that there's something behind that where it's like the minimum value of sustain. I'm sorry, surface tension. And let's see, your other question was about the physical interpretation. I can talk about that as well.
Okay.
So the sustain basically affects how long it takes for the waves to die off. So when sustain is at 1, the waves never die and they just bounce around forever and it's super noisy. And then if it's lower, then they damp out really quickly. Surface tension kind of has to do with the viscosity, you could say, of the air. And when surface tension is set higher, it takes like more effort for the waves to move. It's almost like the model is running waves through like molasses or something. But then when it's lower, the waves move much quicker, and like with less like interruptions, you could say. And so it does make sense that like air is obviously not very viscous, so it would make sense that you would choose sustain to be lower, especially since the kind of thicker sustain when it was much higher, again, was thick. So there's definitely more research that's needed to determine exactly how these numbers are affecting the data, but we have some understanding of it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Team 13.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.